Hi everybody. Today let's talk about remote hiring. A very common question I get from people is, can I hire somebody remotely? When you're a small company and you've been looking for a particular talent for a while and the only talent you can find is in another state or time zone or even country, can you hire that person and have them be effective? Well, you can, but you have to have certain characteristics of the job, the candidate, yourself, and your culture in order to make it successful. Now, many investors and advisors and other entrepreneurs will tell you, don't do it. It's really hard. Creativity happens only when people are right next to each other. How are you going to know if they're delivering? What are you going to do if they're not doing their job? What about all the tax burdens and laws in different states and all this other stuff? There's lots of reasons not to do it. Other people will say, hey, you found the right candidate. You've been looking for a long time. They got the talent you want. Go ahead. Go do it. That's not quite the answer either, because in many cases, the other people had some pretty interesting things to say. So what do you do whenever you're faced with a situation and you feel like you found the right candidate? Do you hire them or don't you? So first, the job has to be right. Now, you can't hire a junior employee remotely. Most of the time, junior employees don't know how to manage themselves appropriately. They're not skilled at advocating for themselves or asking the right questions. And oftentimes they need guidance to be able to perform their jobs well. And that's hard to do when they're remotely. So the right jobs to hire remotely are people who don't need a whole lot of management. So some more senior jobs. Jobs that are highly creative. So those that need to go off and think for a while, like a designer. Or maybe an architect who's going to go off and figure out how to put your software together, not actually do the pair programming, right? That's hard to do remotely, but somebody who's going to design the overall architecture. So someone who's relatively senior, whose role has some clear deliverables, or can be made to have clear deliverables, does not have constant interaction with the rest of the team. So somebody who goes off, produces a deliverable, and brings it back in. Somebody or a job that has well-defined interfaces to the rest of the company. If that job is embedded in a whole bunch of different processes, it's very hard for the remote employee to actually scale into that job. But if the job itself has a number of defined interfaces, small number of defined interfaces with the rest of the company, that's ideal. Also, it's really important to remember you don't really want to hire the standalone manager or leader someplace not with the employees they're going to manage and lead, at first anyway. Now, the job may grow into that over time, but you don't want to have to do management coaching on top of deliverables, integration, coaching, and that sort of thing as well. Right. So that's a really important point. They shouldn't have management responsibility, at least at first. And finally, I think it's important to recognize that most of these jobs aren't going to exist when you're in your ideation phase or you're building your initial prototype. These come once you get up and running and you're starting to get some customers. Most of the time then it's when I need some better hands to be able to solve some harder core problems that are beyond my MVP. Right. Second thing, it's the right candidate. Now, the candidates themselves, it's great if they have the job skills that you need, if they're a great designer and you're hiring a designer remotely, but they have to have more than just the skills required to perform the function. Right? Some of the skills that are really required for a remote employee to be successful are they have to have great communication skills, both written and verbal. They're going to have their interaction with you based on Google Hangouts or Skype or something like that, and it's going to be relatively infrequently. They can't just pop their head over the wall and ask a question, so they're going to have to know how to communicate and get their needs met with infrequent, maybe regular, but still infrequent communication. The second thing that's really important is that they have to know how to advocate for themselves. When they're taking on a project or a new set of deliverables, they're going to have to be able to look at that set of deliverables and say, what am I going to need to be able to be successful at delivering these, and ask for that help up front. They're going to have to raise their hand as soon as they run into any trouble. They're going to have to be able to bulk up their questions and say, I need to understand this, 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 and this so that I can go off and get my work done. So if they're not able to actually discern what it is they need to be able to do their jobs properly, as they're getting the deliverables, they're going to have a harder time actually executing. They're also going to need some real solutions orientation. Now, I kind of hate that because it's sort of a buzzword, but imagine yourself sitting at a desk a long way away from the rest of your team in a different time zone. You're up before they are. You've run into a problem. What do? You wait, waste the time, or do you try and figure out how you can solve your problem on your own, or what you might be able to do, or how you might be able to restructure your work so that you can get something done rather than just sit on your hands? So someone who's able to figure out solutions on their own, move forward, and get the job done whenever they can't get answers from their teammates. Another thing that's really important is integrity. Integrity, in this case, is even more important than somebody who's in the office. Now, integrity is always important, and you have to hire people with great integrity. But when that person is unseen, they're managing their own time, they're managing their own deliverables. They're, in essence, their own manager, even though you may be their boss. You have to have somebody who's going to tell you the truth about their delivery schedule. You're going to have them tell the truth about where they are and the problems they're running into. They're going to have to be vulnerable sometimes and say, I really don't know how to do this, and be honest about that. Otherwise, you're going to run into a lot of execution problems and a lot of missed deadlines and dates. And that doesn't work for anybody, right? So the integrity piece of it is really important. It's really, really important. The advocating for themselves and saying, hello, pay attention to me, I need this is really important as well. Another thing that's really important is they have to fit into your culture well. If they don't fit into your culture, the people that they depend on may not want to work with them very well, may not think of them and include them in decision making. They may not consider the difficulties that your remote employee might have, and they will kind of get left out of the loop over time, and it will be very difficult. If they do fit into your culture really well, people will want to include them more, and they will be a real team member. So it's important that you measure them for fit into your culture as much as you possibly can. Now, sometimes this isn't perfect, but it really does go a long way into solving a lot of problems that you could have down the road with how your teams, remote and local, interact with each other. And lastly, one thing that's really important is their aspirational goals have to fit what you are willing to do for the business and for that particular position. So if you hire somebody who sees themselves being the CTO someday, and you're never going to put somebody who's remote into a CTO position, and you know they're not going to move, whether it's for family commitments or whatever else, your goals don't line up. And as soon as they figure that out, you're going to have an unmotivated remote employee, and things are going to go sideways. So make sure that their aspirational goals fit what you are willing to do over the long term for that particular role. Now, keep in mind that your ideas about what might fit for that particular role might change based on how well that employee does. Your idea today may be, I'm never going to hire my CTO in Boston whenever my company is based in San Francisco. But, after your Series A and you're starting to build a team and there's more talent you can get in Boston, maybe, you never know. But, alignment with your goals and their goals are pretty key. Another thing that you really need to consider when hiring somebody remotely is your culture. Your team culture for your company, even if it's small, even if you're less than 10 people, your team culture has to have 3 key elements to make a remote employee work effectively. First is open communications. Got to have open communication. Second is inclusivity. And third is accountability. Okay, so let's talk about open communications. Because the person is remote and because they're going to depend on people reaching out to them and answering when they reach out, it's really important that your organization has natural, simple communication flow. Communication flow can't be big and burdensome. It can't be written reports all over the place. It has to be natural. There is no water cooler here. So somehow or another, whether you use Slack, whether you use Google Hangouts, whatever you happen to use, communication has to flow really naturally between all of your team members and you. The second thing is inclusivity. There is nothing that sucks worse for a remote employee to find out that decisions have been made about their deliverables and their job and they had no idea when it was done without them. A couple of people might have gotten together in the break room or at a meeting that this person wasn't invited to, and they've gotten now their new marching orders delivered to them without ever having any consultation at all. That doesn't work. And in fact, there's nothing more demotivating than that. So you must make sure that your culture has inclusivity. People have to say, what do you think? And take the answer. And they have to think, that person isn't there and this is important to them. Let's make sure we loop them in. That inclusivity is key. The last thing is accountability. Now, if you don't have a culture of really strong accountability, and this has to be serious, there's a lot of people that tell me they have cultures of accountability, and I go visit their offices, and no, they don't. Right? So you have to have a culture of accountability. Now, the reason why this is important is because if you don't have a culture of accountability and you have a remote employee, it's easy to go, well, it's his fault. That doesn't work, right? People have to own it whenever they miss. There should be no surprises about missed deadlines, right? And people should know why it is. Now, you don't have to punish for this. You don't have to make people afraid to be accountable, but you do have to have that accountability. When deadlines and commitments become suggestions, it's all too easy for the remote employee to go, I'm sitting here waiting, you promised me the work, or to have somebody in the local office go, that guy, who's in Boston or wherever, didn't deliver on time, and I couldn't do my work. Accountability is key if you're going to make the remote employee work. As leader of this team, now distributed, you have to think about what your characteristics as a leader are, and can you manage a remote employee? And that's not an easy thing to do, honestly. A lot of people who manage by sight, I can see what you're doing, I know what's going on, coach in real time without a lot of preparation or forethought, don't really depend on deliverables. Deliverables just kind of get passed out as we see things coming up. If you're that kind of leader, you're going to have a hard time with a remote employee. A remote employee, because you don't communicate with them regularly, and because they're not there in front of you and you can't see them working, you have to treat a little bit differently. From an accountability perspective, from a definition of roles and responsibilities perspective, from a performance management perspective, you have to do a lot more coaching. You have to do a lot more planning so that you can, when you have that directed time with a remote employee, you can get it out on the table. What are they doing well? What aren't they doing well? What do they need to do for you? Have they delivered? How did it work? So all of the feedback that you would normally give when walking by somebody's desk or seeing them in a one-on-one or having lunch with them, you can't do that with a remote employee. So you're going to have to plan a little bit better for your interaction with your employees. And it's also important that you do this with all of your employees. It's really important that the remote employee is not the only one that gets that kind of attention. It causes one of two things. One, your local team thinks, well, why does that person get so much attention directed from you when I can't get the time of day from you? And the other is, well, there's something going wrong with that remote employee because the boss is talking to them all the time and I don't know what's going on there. You don't want either of those things to happen. You have to treat everybody the same. So if you're planning deliverables for the remote employee, you got to plan the deliverables for your local employees as well. If you're going to hold the remote employee to strict accountability, you got to hold everybody, including yourself, to strict accountability, right? So you have to treat everybody the same. In the end, the thing that's most important to remember is everybody needs to know where they stand with you. They need to know where they stand from a performance point of view. They need to understand where they stand from a satisfaction point of view from you with their other team members, so how they're working together as a group, and how they're communicating, especially, so that everybody is clear that the remote employee is just another person on the team, that everything else is the same. Now, special note on remote founders. I get this question a lot, and I see companies trying to make all kinds of justifications for why it is that the CEO can move back to New York because that's where she's from and that's where her family is. And they'll say things like, oh, the customers are in New York and she's our best salesperson, therefore the CEO should be in New York. The development team's still in San Francisco, but the CEO is in New York. Or they'll say things like, oh, the CTO is from Montana and he wants to move back to Montana because his parents are there. And his job is really the creative job. He can be someplace else. Now, in the early stages, this doesn't work. It's extremely rare where this works. And the reason why that is because you're all running very fast. You're all working very hard. If you're in different places, it's easy to be able to make autonomous decisions without considering what's going on with one of your co-founders. CEO is off in a different direction and starts to sell something that the CTO can't commit to. Or your head salesperson is, working away, banging on customer doors, doesn't do a regular check-in, and doesn't realize that one of the features that you promised before you can't actually do because of some snafu, right? So if your founders are distributed, it's incredibly easy to get into a place where you drift apart or you get contentious with each other, and that is death, right? So if you're going to have a remote founder, don't. But if you absolutely have to have a remote founder, you're going to have to do all of the work that's included in what I've said before about a remote employee in spades. And you're going to have to check in really regularly, and you're going to have to keep everybody on the same page. And most of all, you're going to have to be super honest with each other about anything that's going on. You can't surprise anybody with, you know what, I'm losing my interest in this. Or I'm feeling kind of out here by myself. Maybe you guys don't need me. Right? You have to be super honest with everybody if you're going to even try this. Don't recommend it. But if you're going to, and now listen to me, you have to make sure that you communicate even more and you have more of the whole culture of a remote employee in spades. Okay. So in conclusion, hiring remotely is okay as long as you have the right job to hire remotely, not founders. If you have the right job to hire remotely, if you have the right candidate who has more than just the skills to do the job, if you have the right culture in order to accept a remote employee and actually make them successful, and lastly, you have the right leadership skills yourself to make sure everybody knows where they stand with you and that all the communications are on the table and that there are no surprises whenever people don't live up to your expectations. Right? So thank you. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me and I will get back to you as soon as I can. There's a lot more in the talent series that I think could be useful for you. Please sign up for a membership. I'd really love to have you as a member of the community. And thank you again.